Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see all of you this week. We're continuing our series that we began last week, um, entitled Sepharad and Jerusalem Intertwined, where we're looking at the relationship, the historic relationship between Sephardic Jewry and Jerusalem, but the land of Israel more broadly. Last week, we looked at that relationship as almost a relationship of the imagination of Sephardic Jews, of course, quite far from the Holy Land, but the way that Sephardic Jews saw themselves as being connected, really to being the descendants of those who had been the Jewish inhabitants of Jerusalem. And that they cultivated, obviously based off of historic traditions that you find in the Bible and in the Talmud, but really kind of developing even further the meaning of that relationship, that the hope that they one day would return, and seeing kind of the religious significance of the land of Israel to a Jewish life. And ultimately through that, we saw that many of the figures who espoused those views actually acted on them in their lives, eventually moving to Israel or at least spending some time in Israel during the medieval period. We're now going to move on to a completely new phase in Sephardic history, and that's the phase after the expulsion, where essentially Sephardic history or Sephardic Jewry in Sepharad itself has concluded. Well, look, obviously we know that there were some people who didn't leave and some who lived double lives and so forth, but at least in terms of it, kind of the open, shall we say, standard Jewish life, that ends, right? That ends in 1492, 1497 in Portugal. And so that relationship will now move into a new phase. And it's a very, obviously, challenging time after such a terrible upheaval, but it also turns into quite promising and exciting time as well. And many of the, almost the most important works of kind of the past 500 years are produced by Sephardic Jews in the context of the land of Israel. And so there really is this energy that we'll see that kind of culminates or comes to fruition in the context of the Holy Land. And so that's what I'd like to look at with you tonight, is kind of seeing this part two, this next chapter in the history of Sephardim and the Holy Land, where it is going to transition from one of the mind to one of the body, right? To an actual living relationship with the Holy Land. So let's start, as we did last week, by taking a look at some maps, because I think they will illustrate what I'm talking about. Okay. So this first map that we have here is obviously showing the Mediterranean Basin, and it's showing the places that Sephardic Jews went when they were expelled from Spain. And what's interesting, and maybe it's obvious if you thought about, but maybe not originally did people think about that, is that presumably people living in different parts of Spain, right, determined where they went when they were expelled, right? So those who were living closer to Portugal were the ones probably who went to Portugal. Those who were living on the south of Spain were the ones who probably went to North Africa, and those who were living in eastern Spain, right, in places like Catalonia, right, those are the ones who make their way to Italy. And so there may be, in understanding some of the minhagim differences of different, shall we say, groups of the Sephardic diaspora, part of that may be because they actually originated from different regions within, greater Spain, as it were. But we know that obviously a large segment of Spanish Jewry did go east, originally perhaps going to Italy, but ultimately, as the map shows, right, going into the Ottoman Empire. And that will, of course, be the development of what people kind of think of Ladino-speaking Jews, and that rich heritage will really take root from these Sephardic exiles who will settle in the Ottoman Empire, which we'll look a little bit more closely at what the Ottoman Empire is in our next map. But roughly speaking, right, it's covering the areas today of the Balkan region, of Greece, of Turkey, of Egypt, and of course the Holy Land as well, Syria, and so forth. Okay? And so the one thing, though, I'll say about this map is not precise necessarily, because it's kind of showing through these arrows the places that Jews ended up, not necessarily showing the path they took to reach those final destinations. And so while it's showing the line leading directly to Jerusalem and Alexandria and so forth, right, to Cairo, that's not actually how it happened, right? Those aren't the places Jews went to at first when they left Spain, but they are places that Jews obviously end up eventually. And we'll take a look at that process in our next map. But what's just quite, always, I think, quite impactful by looking at this map is really appreciating kind of this Sephardic diaspora. Sephardic Jewry, right, the Jews of Spain probably were the largest population or center of Jewish life in the world at that time. And so it really sent quite a shockwave throughout the Jewish world as, the exiles scattered throughout the Jewish world. And obviously in some places where they resettled, made up sizable portions of the local Jewish population, and sometimes ultimately dominated in those places. And then sometimes they went to places where they remained kind of separate. And so you kind of had two Jewish communities, right? Those who were, in a sense, the original inhabitants in those places, and those who came at a later, came at different times. So, well, that's something to think about, but not necessarily so much for this particular class. So let's take a look, going a bit further. Sorry, I want to go on to the next map here. Okay, so the next map that we have here is one that focuses on the Ottoman Empire itself. And here we have Suleiman the Magnificent, who rules right during the first half of the 16th century, and is credited with inviting Sephardic exiles to settle in Ottoman lands. As you can see from the green colors, right? It's an expanding empire, and it's particularly in those years of 1512 to 1520, right, where there is this huge expansion of territory into the Middle East and into North Africa, under the reigns of Suleiman the Magnificent. And one of the reasons that he's inviting Jews in is because he needs to repopulate some of the different territories. And so there's going to be, Jews will be settled into Salonika, for example, right? The places that become really well known as Jewish places are because Suleiman the Magnificent is settling them in particular places where he thinks that they can be most useful to him. But obviously part of this is coming from this idea that he sees, Spain's loss as his gain, essentially, and believes that he can benefit from these Jewish populations. There's kind of the different, shall we say, aspects of how you understand why he thought he would benefit from Jews. Obviously, many of the Jews were were merchants and scientists and so forth. So there's that kind of side of it. And again, there's also the whole military side and knowing that Jews will be grateful for having a place to live and perhaps can act as important intermediaries between, the Ottoman rulers and the subjects that they ultimately will be ruling over. And obviously Jews are won't be bothered the fact that they're being ruled by the Ottomans, and can therefore kind of help settle some different areas. So in any case, there obviously is this huge influx into the Ottoman Empire. But what you'll notice in terms of the lighter green color, 1512 to 1520, is that those areas, right, of that have Israel in it, right, are only conquered during those years. So at the time of 1492, right, when Jews are invited into the Ottoman Empire, they're not settling in Safed, right, in Sfat. They're not settling in Yerushalayim. They're settling in, right, the places that other areas of the Ottoman Empire, right, places like Salonika and so forth. It's only going to be a little bit later, not that long later, right, that all of a sudden the Ottoman Empire expands, and that will then enable Jews to go from those places and ultimately settle in the Holy Land. And so obviously we know there's Jewish communities that had already existed in the Holy Land, right? Ramban went to live there and so forth, right? We know that there were Jews living there throughout medieval time, right? This is going to lead to an influx of Jewish people living in these places. And obviously some of the more well-known places that Jews settle is Tzfat and Yerushalayim, but also Hebron, Tiberias, and they will end up growing quite substantial Jewish communities in these places as part of Ottoman rule. So what will have happened is that there will have been this transition from being, exiles, these who've been expelled from Spain, to all of a sudden they're living in the land of Israel, right? They're living in the Holy Land, and that will be seen by those who have been expelled as something of great significance, right? Something that was not accidental, but actually is part of a divine plan. And so they will ultimately see that that their expulsion wasn't this terrible calamity that had happened to them, but actually was part of the divine will to lead Jews from the diaspora back to the Holy Land, right? And we'll actually see that there was, shall we say, purpose in their tribulations in ultimately bringing about a renewal, a return to Eretz Yisrael, which of course, and we'll explore this, has messianic overtones all over it. And it gives a sense of the significance or the sense of how important, right, this was, that they were now going to be living in these places, right, that they weren't simply, oh, wow, that's so great, we get to live in Yerushalayim, like, what a wonderful thing, right, but they'll actually see that, oh my gosh, look at what terrible things happened to us, but now look what's happened, right? And it's very difficult, I would say, to look at this era and not compare it, right, to the transitions of the Holocaust to the state of Israel, right, where you think about that sense of, right, terrible calamity, and then, shall we say, on the heels of that, and perhaps even partly as a result of that, right, the state of Israel is established with international recognition, right, and so forth, and obviously the sense, right, that Jewish people have that this is not just, political, machinations, right, but that this actually is part of the Geula, right? This is part of the redemptive process, where we've gone from the darkest of days to the brightest of days, in a moment. And you can actually, I think, see a lot, and there's more to go into with kind of the comparisons between those years after the expulsion and the years after the Holocaust. But I think that's definitely one of the similarities in the experience. And actually looking at what happens at that time, I think is somewhat informative in thinking about our own times as well. So that's perhaps that's something just to kind of be keeping in the back of your mind as we go through this class, just kind of thinking about parallels and lessons and so forth. But it was a dramatic turnaround, as you might, as you could imagine, and one that would have been full of great sense of purpose and meaning for those who had now, almost without them even imagining that such a thing could happen, right? Because at the time of the expulsion, the Ottomans did not control the Holy Land, that all of a sudden, the place that they were, in a sense, expelled to, all of a sudden now controls those lands, and now they're able to go and settle them, and in a sense, strengthen the Jewish settlement in the Holy Land once again. So let's take a look at some of the developments that happen, and it's worthwhile to think about them in the context of what I've just said. Okay. So the next image I have over here is a depiction of Rav Yosef Caro, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, the author of the Cairo Codes. Now, Rav Yosef Caro is 4 years old in 1492, right? So he is expelled as a very young boy from Spain, and his family will settle in the Ottoman Empire. I believe it's in Salonika, and there he'll grow up. He will obviously study and become a great Torah scholar. He is somewhat of a mystic, will eventually claim that a Magid, that a voice, as it were, will tell him that it is time to return to the Holy Land. It's connected perhaps to Shavuot, the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, right? We'll talk about the language of Tikkun in a moment, right? But the moment of the night of the study on Shavuot, which has somewhat Kabbalistic overtones to it. It's the reason that it's not part of the Spanish and Portuguese tradition, right? The Western Sephardim, right? Because it is somewhat Kabbalistic in its origin. And so he says that during that night of study, right, he's visited by this Magid who says it's time to go, right? Right, Yosef, time to pick up and go. And so he ends up going and resettling in Tzfat, and there he will pen, or at least conclude, the writing of the Shulchan Aruch, the Cairo Codes. Now, the Cairo Codes are, of course, even till today, the almost, shall we say, like the starting point or the baseline of halacha, of Jewish law. Of course, he's not the first one to write a code of Jewish law. We know of Rambam and others, but his code really kind of became the standard code, based off of which, right?
Yes. I agree. I've been thinking about it.
Feedback.
Yes.
I suggest you mute everyone, Rabbi Morris.
Oh.
Exactly what I am saying. Yes. Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so let me continue. I'm just muting everyone as I go. If you're not muted already, please mute yourself. Great, thank you, everyone. Okay, and so there he writes the Cairo Codes, and we'll talk a little bit about its reception. But obviously, part of his thinking in doing that is a way to ensure that the traditions of Sepharad will not be lost. Or in fact, perhaps even better to say, is he recognizes that in Sepharad, there were different traditions, right? The territory that we call Spain, it was very large, and there's different communities in different places, right? So there was the Jews of Aragon and Castile and Catalonia and so forth, and they had different minhagim, and so, or different positions about how to apply different areas of Jewish law. And so he's writing the Caro codes to say, we need to have one code, right? That's going to ultimately determine how all of these different Sephardic Jews who lived in different regions, but now have kind of been thrown together, are living in the same places, where originally there would have been different synagogues, the Aragon synagogue, the Toledo synagogue, the Catalonian synagogue, right? And some places it did persist, multiple synagogues like that, but ultimately to say that we have to have one legal code, there'll be the code for everyone, and it will essentially follow the dominant view. And that means, yes, that some communities, their way of doing it will no longer be done, but at least there'll be one code for everybody to follow. Now, there's obviously practical benefits to doing that, but in the context of what I said, there may be an additional element, which is he saw this idea of kibbutz goliotenu, right, the gathering of the exiles, and instead of having as the kind of the language that we find of many Torahs, there should be one Torah, right? There should be one Torah, and ultimately he would be the one, right, to help decide what that one Torah will ultimately look like, right? And so it may be part again of this idea of, we're not in the diaspora anymore. We're all living together in the land of Israel. Let's, instead of everybody doing their own thing, let's figure out one way for people to do things so that we can, in a sense, create a new community, right, in the Holy Land. Okay. We'll get back to that and reflect on that in a little bit. But the one thing I want to draw out over here is that part of the impetus for Shulchan Aruch, which again is the preeminent halakha code even today, right, is this return to the Holy Land, right? And so you can see how this return to the Holy Land is really like capturing the moment, is inspiring a range of activity. Now let's just take a look at one other source. I mentioned that Yosef Caro was also a bit of a mystic, but of course the mystic, the most well-known of the mystics at that time in Tzfat is the Arizal, Isaac Luria, and this is his tombstone in Tzfat, right? The famous blue, right, which is Kabbalistic overtones, and Isaac Luria, his father was actually Ashkenazi. But his mother was Sephardic, and his father died at a young age, and he was raised by his uncle, or educated by his uncle. So essentially, while technically Ashkenazi, essentially was raised as part of these Sephardic communities, originally from Egypt, right, and then eventually settling in Tzfat as well. Again, both those places are part of the newly captured Ottoman Empire. He lives a little bit later than Rabbi Yosef Caro. He's more in the middle part of the 16th century. And his, shall we say, contribution to Jewish mysticism is the idea of tikkun, the idea of repair. So Kabbalah, as we kind of think about it, right, obviously appears in the Zohar, right, which first appears in Spain in the 13th century. But the Kabbalah, as it were, of medieval Spain is very different than the Kabbalah of the Arizal. And how are they different? So they're different in the following way. In medieval Spain, the Zohar, the Kabbalah, was more of a meditation, shall we even say a philosophy of what is the relationship between the spiritual world and the physical world, right? Simply, how was it possible that God, a spiritual being, caused there to exist a physical reality, right? And so I think while today we would say, oh, he's God, so God just did it, right? They were not quite happy with that. They needed to understand of like, literally, like how is matter created from spiritual to physical? And you have the Neoplatonic way of thinking of emanations and so forth. And Kabbalah was somewhat similar of also seeing these emanations, these processes, these Sephirot, right? These different emanations that kind of transitioned from a spiritual reality with angels and so forth to a physical reality, right? With a physical world and human beings. It was more of a way of making sense of the world around them. The Arizal comes along and says, we can take this a step further. He says, now that we understand how the world works, we can do something about making the world better. We can now, in a sense, activate this understanding, activate these emanations in such a way, right, manipulate them in such a way to, shall we say, determine the reality that we wish to see, okay? And so he develops this idea of that the world as we have it, in a sense, is broken, right? That God, in a sense, through the creation of a physical reality, somehow needed to limit himself in some sense, somehow needed to put God's, shall we say, spirit through the world, but in a sense, it's hidden from our perception. And it's our job to return it to its original form, to reveal, right, the spirit that lies encased in all of physical reality, and ultimately to bring the world once again to a state of spiritual perfection, okay? And the way we do that is obviously through mitzvot, right? Following God's law, but also through meditating on the reality of God, right? The more that, in a sense, we reveal or come to see godliness in all things, that actually has the reality of helping godliness to be more apparent in the world around us. And it's not surprising, right, that he puts forward this way of seeing the world at this time, because of course, for the Sephardim, their entire world had shattered, right? Their entire sense of safety in the world, their entire sense of kind of the way the world functions was completely blown apart by the expulsion. And instead of, in a sense, seeing that as, the end, he said, now it's the beginning, right? Because now we are going to repair this world and we are going to make it more perfect than it was before. So nowadays, a lot of times you hear the term tikkun olam in a more kind of social justice context, and that's great. Social justice is very important, but the terminology actually is Kabbalistic, right? And it's referring to the perfection of the world in a spiritual kind of way. And so historians refer to this as kind of active Kabbalah, right? Or practical Kabbalah, right? Kabbalah that's not just philosophical, contemplative, but a Kabbalah which is meant to determine what we do in order to perfect the world. And again, when you see that they've moved to Israel, right, there's this idea that we are moving, right, or that we can, in a sense, create the reality that we hope for. And so we don't simply need to wait, as it were, for Mashiach, for the Messiah to appear, for God to redeem us, but in fact, we can ensure that that happens through our perfection of the world around us, and we can ultimately cause that to come about. And so there is this great fervor, right, in doing all that one can to kind of get to the deepest depths of truths of the reality of the world so that one could bring about the final redemption. And so this was a very powerful idea and a great motivator at that time. parenthetically, if you look at the plans for the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire, ultimately none of them are adopted because they simply were ignored by people who wanted to just rebuild their homes. And so the London after the Great Fire was simply rebuilt on the pre-fire road plan. But one of the suggestions for how to rebuild London was actually to use a city plan based off of this image of the Sepharad that you can see in front of you. And that actually this should be the way that the roads, that the map of the city of London was meant to look. And these were by Christians. It was quite influential, right? This kind of mystic movement of mystics in Tzfat and kind of its influence. And many things that we do in Judaism today were influenced by them, like the Tikkun on Shavuot, like Kabbalat Shabbat, and so forth, many of the aspects. So while we may not think of some of these things in Kabbalistic terms, their origin actually had a bit of a Kabbalistic overtones to them. So both in terms of halakha and in mysticism, they're being, shall we say, motivated or kind of moved further because of this return to the Holy Land following the expulsion. Okay, now I'm going to take you through one more development that happened as a result of this return, and I believe this is in 1538, right? So they've come back, they're living in Tzfat, and there is this movement to restore the ancient rabbinic semicha, right? The idea, right? Nowadays we say, people are called rabbis. They're given semicha. I have it on, I have mine on my wall. But ultimately, it's not real, right? There was historic semicha that was meant to have descended from Moshe, right, from Moses, where he, put his hands on Yehoshua and gave him the authority, and Joshua put his hands on someone else and gave them the authority. And in a sense, from each generation, there was this kind of continuity of transmission of the tradition through this passing on, through this semicha, which literally means, right, the placing of the hands onto the next person. Obviously, sometime after the destruction of the temple, this practice had been lost. And so what happened is that during this time, there was interest in, shall we say, resuscitating semicha, in a sense, ordaining rabbis in the ancient way, or shall I say even more so, with the ancient authority, right? That meaning that these rabbis' rulings would have lasting authority. And then with sufficient number of duly ordained rabbis, you would be able to reconstitute the Sanhedrin, right, the ancient court of the Jews that would then be able to govern and rule, right, as they did once before. And this is very important, right? Even till today, sometimes we have rulings from the Talmud and we say, if there was a Sanhedrin, they potentially could overrule some of those early rulings and say, well, we think things should be different. Right, but without Sanhedrin, what's the mechanism for changing those rules? It becomes a bit challenging. So the idea is they would reconstitute it. There was an attempt a number of years ago to try to reconstitute it. There's been a number of attempts over the centuries. It's never quite made it. So in any case, this did happen. There was this reconstituting, and it was done in Tzfat. It was done in Safed. Now, eventually, the whole thing fell apart because the rabbis in Jerusalem said, well, we weren't consulted. So they said, what authority do you in Tzfat have to reconstitute this? You do not represent the totality of the Jewish people. You don't even represent the totality of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, because we're the rabbis of Jerusalem, right? And we're in the ancient capital, and you're going to do this thing up in Tzfat without including us? So there ended up being a big fight over this, and eventually it didn't fully take off. But one of the people that was given smicha was Rav Yosef Caro, and we know that he then authorized it to several other people as well. So it did last for a bit of time, where you have these individuals who seemingly had had semicha. But what this reflects, again, was this very self-conscious attempt to say the fact that we are in Israel is not an accident. And now that we are here, we need to, in a sense, rise to the occasion and complete this process that's begun of redefining the halakha, our mystical worldview, and the practical institutions of Jewish life, so that we can fully function as we did back in temple times once again. Now, none of this, as I mentioned, was met without controversy. In fact, even Yosef Caro, the Shulchan Aruch, took a long time to be fully adopted. It was even when he first wrote it, there were people who dismissed it, who said, "Who's he?" It took time. It took about a century to kind of be fully embraced as, yes, this is the code of the Sephardim, and so forth. But it wasn't like these things were done where everyone agreed. These things obviously were somewhat challenging. But what all this reflects is there was this great excitement, right? This great sense of hope that was being turned into reality as Sephardic Jews moved back to Israel. Now, I should mention one of the things that was encouraging the reconstitution of the Sanhedrin was perhaps even the idea to be able to give lashes once again. Now, why would you want to give lashes? Well, because many Sephardic Jews had, of course, adopted Catholicism, right, against their will, but nonetheless, and then wanted to return to Judaism. And there was this thought that perhaps in order to do a full return, they needed to receive lashes for their idolatrous practices. And so the idea was, well, we don't have the authority to do that anymore. Oh, but if we have a Sanhedrin, we can do the lashes, and we can, in a sense, help these people to do teshuvah, to do full repentance, and to return. So kind of running over all of these things is also this awareness that not we were expelled and now we've ended up in Israel, but also that there's all these Jews living as Catholics, and we need them to return to Judaism, right? So also that idea of tikkun, of like, we need to fix this broken world, right? We need to get all the conversos to return to Judaism. And if they return to Judaism, and in fact, some of them were returning. We know that there were conversos from Portugal who in the early 1500s left Portugal and went to Salonika. So with our community, we're aware of it in the 1600s, but it was already happening in the 1500s within the first generation of those who had been forced to convert, that they were already also leaving and returning. And so there also was this sense of, look at this amazing return that's happening. Think of like Baalei Teshuvah that are returning to Judaism, and it's finally happening. After this time of assimilation and conversion away from Judaism, in a sense, we now have Jews returning to the tradition, returning to Judaism, and we're returning to Israel. Look, it's all finally coming together, right? And so that's kind of the fervor that's around everything that's happening. Now, fortunately, as we know, that's not what ultimately happens, right? The Sanhedrin is not reconstituted. The Beit HaMikdash is not rebuilt. And in fact, while the 16th century was a time of great optimism and hope and kind of success within the Holy Land, the 17th century will be a time of decline, right? Suleiman the Magnificent will no longer be around, and there will be economic restrictions placed on Jews living in the Holy Land. We'll talk more about that next week. But as a result, there is decline and struggle for the Jews living in the Holy Land. And unsurprisingly, right, that brings a level of despair, as the exile, as it were, is prolonged, as their hopes for redemption are thwarted, as they see that things are not only not getting better, but getting worse, right? You can imagine that for some people, there's a sense of what happened, where has this gone, right? And so historians then trace this to what happens in the middle of the 1600s with the arrival of Shabtai Tzvi, right, the false Messiah, who will be from Jerusalem. He will meet Nathan of Gaza when he's on one of his trips to Egypt. He will be inspired, right, that he is in fact the long-awaited Mashiach, Messiah, and will declare that he is the King Messiah himself, and it is time for the redemption to happen, and it is time for the Jews to return to the Holy Land, right? It is time for the ultimate redemption to occur. And this is not some idea which is foreign. This is not some hope which is, seen as, unbelievable. This is a reality, right, that the people have been hoping for and dreaming of, and particularly at a time where things have been difficult, right? It's something which is perhaps quite longed for, that this in fact should happen. And again, we know that throughout this time, conversos are continuing to return to Judaism, right? You have the establishment of, a thriving Sephardic community in Amsterdam and in Livorno, right? And it is this, very exciting time in some ways. And then you have someone in the Holy Land saying that it is time, it's finally time to return. And so what you see in the picture on the far left, this is from 1666. This is published in Amsterdam, okay? And it shows Shabtai Tzvi sitting on his throne, okay? And you can see it has the word tikkun, right? Rectification on it, right? So there's this messianic Kabbalistic overtone, right, of rectification on a spiritual sense, but also in a practical sense, that there finally is the King Messiah, and it is time to return to the Holy Land. Now we know that this ends in tragedy. It ultimately is not the case, right? He's a false Messiah, and he's eventually imprisoned by the Sultan. That's what's depicted in the middle picture, right? He's there in chains, right? He will ultimately be told, convert to Islam or you'll be put to death. And in fact, he converts to Islam. A whole group of his followers will convert to Islam as well. Again, they will see it as part of this messianic Kabbalistic idea. They'll say, we're going to go into the depths in order to perfect it and ultimately return, right? So we are going to fix that which is broken by entering into, right, or by, in a sense, leaving the tradition in order to, in a sense, perfect the entire world around us, right? So by becoming Muslims, we are, in a sense, going to bring even more things ultimately together, right? It's a bit of a twisted view of how you bring Messiah, right? Not by doing the mitzvot, but by doing averot, right? But by doing averot with the right intention, you're ultimately turning those averot into mitzvot. It's a whole thing. It's a whole way of thinking. It's taking the ideas of the Arizal and, in a sense, distorting them and in a sense, justifying sinning. But saying if you sin with the right intention, then even that's a mitzvah. Okay, that's a whole other idea. In any case, it obviously is a devastating thing that happens. And the picture on the right is actually depicting Jews in Salonika doing teshuvah, repenting, even by having people lash them, right, as a way of repenting for the fact that they had followed a false Messiah. Okay, so there is a great awareness of where have we gone wrong? Like, what have we done? And so you've kind of gone from this moment of obviously the terrible travails of the expulsion to this time of great hope and excitement about this future and the bringing Messiah and writing a new halacha and reconstituting the Sanhedrin, to ultimately, obviously, those hopes are dashed. It's not yet the right time for that to come. And ultimately, it leads to despair. It leads to false movements. which ultimately lead to greater despair. And so you find over here perhaps a somewhat depressing end, in a sense, to this kind of return to the Holy Land. And we'll kind of pick up with that in next week's class to kind of see, in a sense, how were the pieces picked up. But I don't want to leave just with that thought, because ultimately, while, shall we say, the movement didn't succeed in that moment, many of the contributions that were made did survive, right? So you do have the lasting influence of the Arizal. You do have the lasting influence of the Shulchan Aruch. And so you do have this, shall we say, success, that because of the inspiration of the return to the land of Israel, some of the most important works in Jewish tradition were produced and continue to kind of feed, right, the Jewish spirit. And in that sense, there is this awareness that sometimes, like a moment of inspiration, right, can last, for centuries. And so while, shall we say, their immediate goal or hope was dashed, the interplay between the sages and the land of Israel did produce some of the most long-standing and important and influential Jewish works, certainly of the past half millennia. And so we can see also the great power of the relationship of Jews returning to their own land, in that it can really inspire incredible creativity and innovation, which perhaps one associates with the diaspora, that of stagnancy, right? But in the Holy Land, right, the idea that we must be creative, we must be kind of really thinking so that we can create something great going forward. And while they perhaps didn't create everything they had hoped, they certainly did create some very important and lasting changes. And so next week, we're going to look at kind of what happens afterwards. The mid-1600s afterwards, kind of the transition from this kind of post-expulsion messianic era to really a more modern, stable Jewish life in the Holy Land, and the role that Sephardim played in that process, and particularly the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, and the important role the Spanish and Portuguese Jews played in creating the modern world. I think the title I gave this is Jerusalem, the city that Montefiore built. And so we'll include a bit of Montefiore stories as part of this. Before we finish, does anybody have any questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question. Okay, so then I think we will conclude here for tonight. Wonderful studying with all of you. Always a pleasure. And while this class was a little bit depressing, perhaps that's appropriate for the week leading up to Tisha B'Av, which commemorates the destruction. But next week, which is the class that kind of leads to the rebuilding, will be perfect on the heels of the conclusion of Tisha B'Av, where we then begin looking to the future and the Nechama and the consolation. So feeling a little down, that's okay. That's okay. Next week, hopefully, we'll have a bit more of a pick-me-up. Good to see everyone.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Fascinating.
Thank you.
Really
Bye.
Thanks.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a good night.
Bye.